think the best way for us to handle this is that if you can raise your hand, there's a button called reactions, or you should see it if you have a different version of Zoom. If you open up the participant list, you should see a raise hand function there. Then you should be able to unmute yourself. We'll invite you to come forward, and then you should be able to unmute yourself. Any problems, let us know in the chat. So Jim, I believe you're chairing the questions for the team.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Marion. Very happy to do that. And thanks for those presentations, which gave a really good hands-on sense of how DAFNI works and what's the whole suite of NISMOD models which are now enabled on DAFNI. I'm sure that will have raised some questions, though I'm not seeing any hands right now. Let's just pause for a moment around that, see what's coming through. I mean, if I might kick off, Rose, you showed us the data facilities within DAFNI and the metadata arrangements. Can you say a bit more about the data sets that are there at the moment and the process by which we can increase the number of data sets on DAFNI?
Sure. So I'm not hugely familiar with all of the data sets that are on DAFNI at the moment, because really anyone can add their own data sets whenever they want at the moment. So once you add a data set to DAFNI, it's initially private, so most users won't see it, but you can share it with the public catalog, and at that point everyone on DAFNI would see it, and at that point I guess it would for all intents and purposes increase the number of data sets that are visible on DAFNI. So I'm not hugely familiar with what people have in their private areas, but we have all of the NISMOD data sets on there at the moment. So all of the data sets that you need to run any of the NISMOD models. We also have the data sets required for the UDM model. I think we have the NOMIS data sets are on there as well. And there's another big set of data sets that I've forgotten the name of right now. I don't know if Brian or Marion can remember the other big set of data sets.
Brian.
Mute there, Brian.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Rose. Yes, I mean, we've got about, I think it's around 700, I think it is, data sets at the moment on these. A lot of the NOBIS ones are available. We also, though we haven't loaded them up, have access to a lot of the open gov data. That is all. We have it at hand. We haven't loaded it up, so we'd load it up on demand. There's rather a lot of it. We also have good relationships with the Ordnance Survey, so we have sort of access to master map data. But as Rose said, a lot of the demand, a lot of the drive here is what users require for their models. So rather than kind of being speculative too much, we want to kind of have that demand from users and on their models. And also we're very aware that a lot of data that we can access is in other repositories. So we are sort of actively discussing with other data providers like the Office of National Statistics or the environmental data kept in the NERC data centers, or the UK Energy Data Centre, which is coincidentally also hosted at our institution. So I mean, we don't see that we're going to subvert those places, that we're going to sort of take over their data. But what we want to do is sort of have access to their catalogues. And if people need data from those places, then we can pull them in relatively easily and make them available to the user community. So it's, you know, the data collection is very much a work in progress, and we don't see, as I said, don't see it as necessarily holding master copies of everything, but it's kind of how we then continue to make that data available and usable to people. So yeah, I mean, so it's an area where if people have particular data needs, and they think, you know, they identified, you know, good areas or good data sets that they'd like us to make available, then yeah, please, we'd love to talk to you about that, and try and get those useful data sets onto the system or make them available through the system.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. And there's a question from Thalia Baldwin from the Geospatial Commission, which I'll come to right now, and Adrian Higford has got his hand up. But while we're talking about data, some people from an infrastructure perspective will be concerned about data security, and in particular around cybersecurity. So perhaps you could just say a few more words about the security system and how that all works.
So yes, it is, you know, something that has been thought about from the beginning. We, you know, as Rose showed in a demonstration, we have a sort of user access model based around users and groups, whereby we can restrict access to data, and it's very much in the user's control about who they can give data access to, and that will kind of be reflected through the system. So it's not just that we can. It should be, you know, if you're using a model uses a particular data set, then that the rights to that data kind of reflected into the model, so it kind of it flows through the system. It is, you know, we do have, but at the same time, a you know, mechanism to make that data open and make it more widely available. But as I said, that's very much under the user's control. It's the data. You know, we see the person who's providing the data as the data owner, and you know, they have control over who they make it available to. And if they want to make it open, that's great. But it's very much under their control. Yeah. So I mean, it's a little bit of a work in progress. We're doing actually some work at the moment to make some of the login processes a little bit more straightforward. So we are looking to the for academic users, looking to the UK Access Federation, which sort of distributes passwords and things, so we don't need to manage passwords in quite such the same way. You know, people can use their university logins to access the system, but nevertheless, you know, all within that same security model. So it's something I think, you know, we also want to, you know, as we move from a development environment into a more production environment, we want to sort of review this and make sure that we are continuing to do all the right things in the future to make sure we have good data integrity. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Brian. So Thalia, thanks for your question around modeling of land use change, and whether we're doing that on DAFNI. And the short answer is yes, in particular in relation to the Oxford-Cambridge, which Tom created. Now, I saw that Ali Ford, who's the creator of the UDM model, the urban development model, was on the line at the start of the. I think Ali's had to leave, so I'll just say a few words about that UDM model. But while I'm doing that, we actually have quite a nifty web-based demonstration, and I suggest that Tom puts to that in the chat now, so that Thalia can take a look at that. Because as you'll have heard, Thalia, from Tom's explanation of the scenario analysis we're doing in the ARC, which ultimately intended to inform the development of the space framework, that is, you might think about that as being a constrained optimization, spatial optimization for subject to objectives for where housing should go. So the proximity to existing development, proximity to transport mix, and proximity to employment. On the other hand, subject to constraints, so in particular areas for nature, and subject to a range of different scenarios for the density of housing development. The UDM model then allocates, given amount of new housing, what are the optimal places for that to be located, and one can change those objective functions and constraints so you can create a large number of possible urban development scenarios. I think that's really interesting in its own right. And then, as Tom explained, we would use that to then understand how infrastructure services like transport, electricity, water, digital communications might evolve in the future of the and I can see that Tom has posted that web-based demo in the chat now, so click through to that and you can have a look at how that actually works. Thanks a lot for the other questions coming up in the. I'll come to those in a moment. Adrian's been waiting patiently with his hand up, so Adrian, you want to come in now.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Rose and Martin, for your presentations. I'm really pleased to see the progress. I work at the University of Southampton, and where the transport model has been developed, and I'm using the transport model on high-performance computing facilities in Southampton at the moment, waiting for them to arrive on DAFNI. I've got a couple of questions. The facilities in Southampton take about half an hour to run the basic baseline model. I wonder if it's actually quicker on DAFNI. And a question for Martin. I've got no visualization capabilities. I have to just download files and work in Excel. Obviously quite keen to use the visualization capability on DAFNI. So when do you think that's going to be upgraded? Thanks.
Well, I can answer your questions on the visualization side of things. So the tool itself is complete as a separate tool from DAFNI, and the only thing left to do is to integrate it into DAFNI, which is underway at the moment. And to complete that integration, I would say it's going to take maybe a month, but there might be other processes that need to be done on the DAFNI side of things that I'm not aware of.
Okay, so I'm going to have to get up my Python skills, I think, is the answer to that.
Yeah, well, as Rose showed, the Jupyter Notebook interface is there and ready to be used. So yeah, if Python is doable, then that could be used straight away.
Okay.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk about that a bit more. Actually, maybe we could. Yeah, we could talk about that a bit offline, perhaps. Whether there's anything we could do.
Yeah.
Maybe give them some. Yeah. Okay. We could talk offline about what we might do there.
Shall I? Let's go to Adele Maher's question. Adele's from MHCLG, joining us, and there's a series of questions here which I'll do my best to give a quick answer to, and then Brian might wish to come in as well. So the first is, well, I'll break the first question, which is around open access, open source, and public use, into two parts, because the different answers to those things. The first thing is that the code to develop DAFNI is will be open source. That was part of our original agreement. In terms of all of the models that sit on DAFNI, that is at the modeler's discretion. But we obviously have a very strong preference for open source. All of the NISMOD codes are open source. One of the pieces of design that we've been thinking about is making the link between open source codes on GitHub and implementations on DAFNI as seamless as possible, to support use of open source codes. But some of the models we're talking about are not open source. Some of them use bits of code, and in that case, DAFNI is able to handle the license arrangements for those components. In terms of public use, DAFNI is not intended to be a system for completely open use by the general public, in the sense that there will always be some registration arrangement before people are provided with use. But the goal is in future for that registration to be very much responsive to users' needs, be they in academia or government. Having said that, there are going to be lots of visualizations and outputs which will be of interest to the general public, and we want to create ways in which the general public can interact with models and results. And the ARC spatial framework demonstration that Tom link in the chat there is a really nice example of that. So that is a website, and it's openly accessible. You can click on that. Those are results generated from UDM and DAFNI, which enable the public to explore modeling results. That's going to really be our model, is registered users of DAFNI, but then where results need to be made available, and we're very much interested in engaging the general public in this type of, then we can create web-based interfaces to enable them to do that. The second question, sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope it was helpful. Second question is around data updated and live. As Brian said, data really is the responsibility of the users, though we're within DAFNI doing our best to provide some element of a curation service. And in the DAFNI proposal going forwards, which comes to the third question, there is budget within that for data curation, because we recognize the importance of that. But simply the facility Rose demonstrated around metadata and what Brian was explaining about linked data provides a lot of what's needed for responsible data curation. And then the third question is, how is this financed and what's the future finance model? So question, is it not for profit? Question. So the answer to that is it's definitely not for profit. Up until this point, the capital development of DAFNI has been funded from a £8 million grant from EPSRC, UKRI. That grant will come to an end this year. And we are applying for underpinning funding for another 2 years from EPSRC to provide a basic level of service. The rationale for that is also to bridge into big things to come, the national digital twin, the UKRI digital research infrastructure, and other things coming down the line, in which DAFNI is a central part to the solutions to all of that. And finally, we can see some potential industrial partners making use of DAFNI, and on that basis, we've developed a costing model for that. And we've also developed a costing model for researchers who are planning to do a lot of research on DAFNI. DAFNI's free at the point of use. That's our principle. But if researchers are going to do a lot, which involves a lot of new development, then we're expecting them to cost that into their research grant application. So we're not just looking for the underpinning funding, but we're looking for additional funding to do particular projects. The final note there is one uncertainty, in fact, that we've applied for. That the government people on the line will recognise that there's still uncertainty in relation to the outcome. Spending review, UKRI and BEIS have still not exactly clear where they stand with respect to funding going forwards. And this is getting pretty critical for DAFNI, that a decision is made, at least in terms of this first couple of years of bridging funding, which we have applied for and is being considered by EPSRC at the moment. So I hope that's answered your questions, Adele. Anything to add to that, Brian?
No, I think that was a really comprehensive answer. Answers everything. Yes, I mean, certainly, you know, as we're moving to a development, a production phase, you know, we would want to consider how we keep data, create data, and keep data up to date. We've looked at things like, you know, certain data sets we can sort of update automatically, if you like, as new things come online. We can do that. Other things we will need much more manual processes. Of course, historic data will be there, always, you know, will continue to be there, and that will continue to be available. But obviously, as new versions come up, we need to make them, add them to the system. I think you've done quite a comprehensive kind of discussion about our future finance model. Definitely not for profit, you know, but financed from within the research sector, but making the outputs available to partners, very much so. I mean, I mentioned the OpenClim project as, you know, as another project that we're heavily involved in. A lot of the discussion around that is how do we make the models and which doing risk analysis and adaptation for climate change available to the DEFRA, or the Climate Change Commission, in that case, in a way that they can use it straightforwardly. And I think, you know, I think it's a really important aspect that we do make that available. And I think how we make the thing available does depend on what your intent on the class of user. I mean, accessing computational resources is never, you know, to upload models and run models is sort of never free. You know, you go to Amazon, you have to take a credit card, so it has to be limited in some way because they're expensive resources. But we would anticipate that for researchers and research partners, we would have a baseline of free at the point of use, which is and as Jim mentioned, for heavy use and for changing functionality on the system, we would seek additional funding from grants.
Okay, thanks, Brian. There's a good question from Jordan about net zero. I suggest we come back to that, and in the meantime, just follow up on a few of the questions around data. There's a question specifically from Eva Johnson, specifically about data for the transport, all how they're captured, verified, updated, and I think I'll pass that to Adrian in Southampton. There's also a question in terms of run times, and Rose has answered that in the chat there. There's a question from Richard Plotchek around data provenance and data generated by other models. So maybe I'll pass that one to Brian in a moment. And then Zoe Henderson has a question about the energy module and representation of the electricity network and the gas network within that. On that one, it's our colleagues in Cardiff University who developed the energy model, Asad Chowdhury, Nick Jenkins, Jean-Jean Wu, and I can't see any of them on the line, so maybe Tom Russell could try and pick up on the energy model. But first of all, back to Adrian for a few words about the data provenance verification and keeping it updated for the transport model.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So my colleague, Milan Lovrich, was the one who developed this model, and as part of the development process, he created an origin destination matrix for all of the links in the UK, which correspond to the DFT's traffic estimates for main roads. And then there is a sort of underlying calculation about what happens between those main roads on more local roads, so that the transport model essentially mimics the road transport network in 2015. That's when the baseline is set. That's where we have to go from. So all model runs start in 2015 and build up from there. So that's how they were captured, and the verification process is that they kind of match onto the DFT estimates. I don't think there's any plan to update that. That's quite a big job, I suspect, and certainly beyond my capabilities. There are also other input files, which are static CSV files based on research in terms of costs and emissions and so on. So that's essentially where the transport data comes from. I don't know about other models. I suspect that Tom might be able to give us information if there are any sort of non-static inputs.
Yeah, let's, Tom, if you would like to say more, and also anything about the energy data sets, and then I'll switch back to Brian to see whether he has anything to add in relation to Richard's question. Tom, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but any further thoughts in response to Eve on the energy model? I see that you've put some links in the chat there, but do you want to say any more?
So yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to Adrian on the transport model. On the energy model, it's broken down into several modules. So there's an energy demand model, which takes essentially national statistics and detailed statistics about time and use of different end uses for energy demand in residential, commercial, and industrial settings. And that runs representing the UK in its local authority districts. Also takes in data from the Met Office on historical weather and from the Weather at Home climate series, which is the same one we use for the water, which feeds into hydrology in the water model. So that gives us energy demand across those three sectors. The transport model produces outputs of trip starts from different locations according to fuel. In the transport model, it's broken down by engine types and vehicle types. But to plug into the demand, we take numbers for electricity usage, and all of that demand is then aggregated into numbers per fuel or per vector for an energy supply model. So that energy supply model is the one Jim referenced that's developed in Cardiff. It's called CGen. I can dig out a paper link, but that's probably on the ITRC website as well. And that represents both the electricity and gas networks at the transmission level. So yes, it has gas, and it also represents the local generation and renewables in a sort of energy hub model. So there's a regional sense in which demand reduction can be applied or heat networks can be introduced, and there's the national sense in which we model those transmission grids. I hope that answers the question. Runtimes, again, sort of under the hour ballpark for a time step. So depending on how many scenarios and strategies you want to run, there's options for lots of parallelism, and DAFNI gives us that capability to run things in parallel in different workflows. But yeah, can be a reasonably long model runtime.
Great, thanks for that, Tom. Brian, any further thoughts in relation to Richard's question?
Yeah, just before I say that, just to comment on what Tom just said. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we can do if there's a need is actually there's a way that we launch jobs is kind of in a very quite a standard way at the moment, but if there's a need to increase parallelism, we can do stuff behind the scenes to improve that kind of performance if that's really necessary. Okay, so about provenance. Well, this is one advantage, I guess, of the way we've done this, building around these components of the modeling service and the database service. So it's so we're not presenting the users with a file system, for example. We're mediating the data through a repository, which means that we can much more easily in that metadata in the repository say where the data's come from. So it's a question around provenance, whether the data comes from a previously run model or is data that's come from outside and not been processed by us in advance. Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, we would record where that data comes from, what model run it came from, what instance of the workflow it came from, and so you would be able to look back at the data and see where it comes from and work out the provenance of it. And we are, one of the things we're looking at the moment to kind of improve the sort of usability of the system is how to expose the logging from the system as well. So you know, what information would we provide back to the users on runs? We should do a lot of internal logging, but you know, we need to expose that much more to users. That would give additional information about the exact performance of the runs and things. But yes, you know, one of the things that we've been thinking of from the beginning is we need to demonstrate the provenance of data and in the system. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Brian. And let me just come back to the question from Jordan about net zero, and then we'll move on with our agenda. And I'll pass back to you, Brian, for a few more words on how to engage with DAFNI. But the question was around what are the opportunities to exercise this capability to inform policy options for net zero? In short, I would say the opportunities are huge and they're already being grasped. DAFNI is focused on national infrastructure, and the majority of greenhouse gas emissions come from energy and transport sectors, where energy is in here within our energy model. The CGen model has electricity, gas, heat within it, and hydrogen. And so that model, which Tom provided an overview of, both the energy demand and the energy supply model, covers all of that. And that is coupled with the transport model, which computes transport emissions for a whole range of different future transport scenarios. And alongside that, within the NISMOD system, there are coupled water and digital models. So that enables us to, for example, to look at energy use in the water sector, and indeed the need by the energy sector for water, in particular cooling water, and how that will vary in a net zero future in which there will be carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, both of which will have implications for freshwater withdrawals. And the attraction of NISMOD is that it has the interdependencies. And so we can look, for example, at these energy water interdependencies. And if we look at energy and transport, you will recognize how in the net zero future, these become deeply integrated when we have electric vehicles and vehicle grid charging. So vehicle batteries are being used to provide storage and grid balancing, combined with a very high proportion of intermittent renewables from offshore wind and solar. In a net zero power and transport system like that, the integration between the two is incredibly important, and you need to simulate that at really fine timescales. And we've been able to do that in the NISMOD system already. We've got some results which will shortly be coming out of a joint analysis of the energy and transport systems, answering the questions around how much to G contribute, what are the implications of electrification of transport at fine spatial and temporal scales. And it's that capacity to look at finer scales, I think, is very interesting as well. That's what we did in the Oxford-Cambridge arc, whereas you can cookie cut a particular part of the country, but then look at how that is connected up with the rest of the country. Because you can't look at things like electricity or transport within the arc in isolation, because it's part of a bigger system. But within that analysis, which Tom and Adrian referred to, we were able to do for England's economic heartland, the subnational transport body, a decarbonization pathways analysis for the transport sector. And in the other piece of the arc analysis, which we did in ITRC, we were able to demonstrate that there is a possible net zero future for the developments within the arc, including looking at how much of that energy could be locally generated one way and another. So those are the types of net zero question which we're able to analyze. With that, I see that you've got your hand up, Jordan. So by all means, dive in.
Jim, it's just really useful. Thank you. I just wanted to sort of an extension to that. I guess by implication, then, there are opportunities then to couple this with economic models, or as they emerge, behavioural models. I.e., how are people choosing different modes? How might the broader investment picture look? So if we wanted to look at policymakers are wanting to make decisions about short-term versus long-term economic gain, or whatever. So the opportunity to couple this to those sorts of models, I guess, within this framework, is very much there.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. And there's clearly there's more to do in particular in relation to those economic questions, which are really coming to the fore in terms of levelling up. And the role of infrastructure alongside other portfolios of interventions with the levelling up agenda. Okay, thanks for that. There's a question from Brian Love. I think I'll suggest that Adrian takes that offline and maybe put something in the chat for Brian there around modal shifts. And I will hand back to our own Brian Matthews to take us on to the next item on the agenda.